6 prisoners escaped, 5 got caught, 1 came home. My best friend Maggie knocked on my door Wednesday morning, which was nothing unusual. I opened the door to her holding to-go cups of coffee and looking like she had seen a ghost. She waved away my concern. She asked me in a low voice if I'd heard about the prison break. The way she said it, barely above a whisper, made every single hair on the back of my neck stand up. She seemed afraid to make it real by saying it out loud. I'd been half watching the TV across the room with the volume on low. Mostly I was thinking that I really needed to call my mom back and that I was almost out of dish soap. That is how ordinary that morning had been right up until that moment. I told her no, I hadn't heard. My voice came out slower than I intended because my brain was already 2 steps ahead of my mouth. It was already running through the list of things that phrase could mean for me specifically. None of them were good. She turned her head toward the TV. I followed her gaze and saw the news coverage with the graphic in the corner that said, "Breaking." I felt something cold settle in the middle of my chest. I asked her if it was Northfield Correctional, but I already knew the answer. I just needed someone else to say it because I couldn't trust my own mind at that moment. She barely nodded. I sat very still for a second because that was his prison. That was where my ex-husband Mitchell had been locked up for the past 3.5 years, serving a 10-year sentence for domestic assault. I had spent every single one of those 3.5 years slowly rebuilding myself from the ground up in a new city, 200 miles away from anyone who knew what he'd done to me. I asked her how many had gotten out. She said they were reporting 6, but that no names had been released yet. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my hands over my face, and told her it was probably nothing. I said they'd catch them all fast. She agreed, but neither one of us believed it for even half a second. I reached over and grabbed the remote. I turned the volume up just as the news anchor started talking in that strange flat tone they use when something is genuinely bad, but they're trained not to sound scared. She was describing how a riot had broken out in one of the housing units, and how 6 inmates had used the chaos to cut through a perimeter fence and steal a guard's car from the lot. They were showing footage of the fence with a jagged hole in it, and the empty parking space where the car had been. Looking at that hole in the fence, I thought about the day Mitchell was sentenced. He sat at that defense table in his suit and looked directly at me when the judge read the verdict. He smiled at me, this slow, quiet smile like we were sharing a private joke. It was as if this was just a temporary inconvenience and he'd be seeing me very soon. I'd had nightmares about that smile for 2 years after. Maggie put her hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I said yes, it's probably not him. There were 6 people. Plenty of them probably had somewhere more important to be than hunting down an ex-wife. I said it like I meant it because I'd spent years training myself to sound calm even when I was coming apart inside. Showing fear around Mitchell had always made things worse, so I'd learned to keep my face still, my voice even, and my hands loose at my sides no matter what was happening. Maggie didn't look convinced, but she let me send her home after I promised to call her if anything changed. After she left, I locked the deadbolt and the chain. I pushed the heavy bookshelf in the hallway a few inches toward the front door, not all the way, just enough that it would slow someone down. Then I stood in my kitchen for a minute trying to figure out what to do with myself. I did laundry that didn't need to be done yet and reorganized 2 kitchen drawers. I scrubbed the bathroom grout with a toothbrush. This was something I'd been meaning to do for months, but I had never actually wanted to do it until that afternoon. I needed something to keep my hands busy so my brain couldn't take over completely. Every time a car door closed outside or a pipe in the wall knocked, I went rigid for a second before I could talk myself back down. By mid-afternoon, I decided to bake a batch of cookies because it required focus that felt like the right kind of distraction. I'd just pulled them out of the oven when I realized that my whole building smelled like brown butter and vanilla. I was standing in my kitchen holding a hot pan, thinking about how 3.5 years ago I hadn't been allowed to bake because Mitchell said the smell gave him headaches. That thought made me so angry that I had to set the pan down and breathe for a minute. I'd built this apartment, this life, and this freedom from scratch. I wasn't going to let even the idea of him take it from me. I ate 3 cookies standing at the counter and told myself I was fine. The afternoon went gray and then dark. I turned on every light in the apartment, which I never normally did. I was sitting on the couch with a book I wasn't reading when the evening news came on. The anchor's voice had shifted from that calm, flat tone into something sharper and more urgent. She said that authorities were prepared to release the names of the 6 escaped inmates. I felt my whole body go tight. She read the first name, and it wasn't him. She read the second, and it wasn't him. She read the third and fourth and fifth. With each one, I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. I was already halfway through thinking that I'd been ridiculous to spiral this badly when she read the 6th name. It was his. The rest of what she said turned into noise I couldn't process. I stood up from the couch and just started moving. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and threw in clothes without looking at what they were: a charger, my laptop, and my passport. Some part of my brain said to take my passport even though I didn't know why. I grabbed my medication and my phone charger again. I'd already packed one, but I grabbed a second anyway. I texted Maggie one word, his name. She called me back in 40 seconds and told me to go to my parents and not to stop anywhere on the way. I texted my mom that I was coming and that I'd explain when I got there. Then I was in my car and on the highway before I had consciously decided to be. The drive was 3 hours. I didn't turn on music and I didn't call anyone because I needed both hands on the wheel and all of my focus on the road. I kept checking my mirrors compulsively. I knew that was irrational because he'd only been out for hours and he didn't know what car I drove or where I was living. However, Mitchell had always been resourceful in ways that frightened me. He always knew things I hadn't told him. He always found ways to make sure I understood that nothing about my life was fully mine. There was a silver sedan that stayed 2 cars behind me for about 40 miles. I changed lanes 3 times just to see what it would do. It changed lanes 2 each time. I was so convinced for about 10 minutes that it was him that I almost pulled over to call 911. Then the sedan took an exit. I had to sit with the embarrassment of realizing I'd been tracking a stranger for 40 miles, which told me how far gone I already was. I got to my parents' house a few minutes past midnight. My mom was waiting at the door and pulled me in before I'd even made it up the porch steps. My dad took my bag and didn't ask any questions. He just said they'd made up the guest room and that I should sleep. I did. I slept for almost 11 hours straight in a bed with fresh sheets and a door that locked and 2 parents in the next room. I didn't dream about anything. I stayed for a week. My dad checked the news every morning and gave me a summary so I didn't have to watch it myself. By day 3, they'd caught 2 of the 6 escapees in Kentucky. Both were caught trying to cross into Ohio with with bad fake IDs. The police were describing active leads on the remaining 4. The coverage kept using phrases like narrowing in and coordinated sweep. Every day I tried to absorb that language and let it mean something reassuring. There was no confirmed sighting of Mitchell in any of the areas being reported. The detective who'd handled my original domestic assault case called me on day 4 to let me know they were aware of my history with him and that I was on a notification list. She told me to stay somewhere he didn't have an address for, which I was already doing, and to check in every couple of days. I did. I called her on day 5 and day 7. She told me the same thing each time. They had no confirmed location, but he hadn't crossed any state lines they could identify. She advised that I should stay put for now. On day 7, I told my parents I was going home the next morning. My mom didn't argue. She just started making me food to take with me. My dad walked through some things with me about the apartment. He asked about the locks and if my building had security cameras in the parking lot. I told him it had 2 in the lobby and 1 at each entrance, and he said that was good. I woke up on day 8 and the sun was out. The temperature was in the low 60s and it was a genuinely beautiful morning. I stood on my parents' porch with my coffee and thought about the apartment I'd chosen by myself, the furniture I'd bought by myself, and the job I'd gotten by myself. I thought about the entire life I'd assembled piece by piece after Mitchell went away. I thought about the cookie smell, the full nights of sleep, and the weekends I'd started spending hiking with a group from work. I was not going to let him take any of it. I called Detective Haynes one more time before I left and told her I was heading back. She was quiet for a second and then she said she'd rather I waited another few days. I asked her if there was a specific reason or if it was just general caution. She said it was general caution. I said I understood, but that I'd been careful and that I had good locks. I mentioned that my building had security and that I couldn't keep hiding indefinitely. She said she understood, but to call her the minute I was inside with the door locked. I said I would. I loaded my bag into the car and hugged my parents on the porch. My mom held on a few seconds longer than usual, and my dad told me to text when I got there. I pulled out of their driveway at just past 9 in the morning. The sun was doing that thing where it cuts horizontal through the trees, and everything looks almost too bright to be real. I was about an hour into the drive, feeling almost normal, when my phone lit up on the passenger seat. I glanced at it and saw it was Maggie, and I put it on speaker. She didn't say hello. She just said my name the way you say someone's name when the news is bad. I felt the lightness of the morning drain right out of me. She told me that someone had broken into my building the night before. Not my apartment, she said quickly. Just the building. Someone had gotten through the back entrance. The building manager had found the door propped open that morning with a rock. The security camera at that entrance had been spray painted over sometime during the night. I pulled off at the next exit without making a conscious decision to do it. I sat in a gas station parking lot with the engine running while she kept talking. She said the building manager had called the police and that 2 officers had come out and done a walkthrough. They hadn't found anything disturbed inside the building itself. No broken locks on any apartment doors, nothing taken from the mailroom or the storage units in the basement. Officially, the police were treating it as a random break-in, probably someone looking for a place to sleep or for packages to steal. There was no reason to connect it to Mitchell. I sat there and said nothing for a moment. She said my name again and asked if I was still there. I said yes, I'm here. She asked what I was thinking and I said I was thinking about the camera. She asked what about it. I told her that the back entrance camera was the one that covered the parking lot where I always parked my car. If someone had wanted to watch my parking lot without being recorded, painting over that specific camera was exactly how they'd do it. The line went quiet for a few seconds. She told me not to go back yet and I said I knew. I sat there in that parking lot with the engine running for another few minutes, just staring through the windshield. I called Detective Haynes and got her voicemail. I left a message telling her what Maggie had told me, and then I sat and waited. She called me back in under 10 minutes. Her voice was different than it had been that morning, more careful. She asked me where I was. I told her I was pulled over about an hour from home, and she told me to stay there while she made some calls. I sat in that gas station parking lot for 45 minutes. A teenager in an apron came out of the station at one point and asked if I needed help. I said no, I'm just waiting on a call. Thank you. He went back inside. I watched the traffic move on and off the highway, and thought about how Mitchell had known every single time I'd tried to leave during our marriage, exactly where I'd gone. I used to think he'd guessed or gotten lucky, but eventually I'd understood that he'd planned. He always had a secondary route. He thought further ahead than I gave him credit for. The painted camera felt like a secondary route. Detective Haynes called me back and said that the break-in had been flagged and that they were taking it seriously in the context of his escape. They didn't have enough to confirm a connection yet, but I absolutely should not go back to the apartment that day. She was going to try to get a car parked outside my building overnight. I said okay. She said she meant it, and I said I know you do. We hung up. I turned the car around and drove back to my parents' house. My mom didn't say a word when I walked through the door. She just took my bag again and put it in the guest room and handed me a cup of coffee. I sat down at their kitchen table and tried to figure out what I was supposed to do next. I stayed 2 more days. On the second extra day, Detective Haynes called to tell me that the overnight patrol at my building had turned up nothing unusual. There'd been no further incidents. In her professional opinion, the painted camera was likely unrelated. The building sat near a bus stop, and there'd been 2 other petty thefts on that block in the past month. It was consistent with the pattern. 3 of the 4 remaining escapees had now been caught, 1 in Tennessee, 2 more in upstate New York. Mitchell was the only one still out. All resources were currently concentrated on finding him. She told me his last confirmed proximity had been a stolen vehicle recovered about 90 miles north of the prison nearly a week ago. There had been no credible sightings since. Her honest read was that he'd gone to ground somewhere and was lying low. She said that I could go home, but that I needed to stay alert and call her for any reason, no matter how small. I said I would. I drove home the next morning. The sun was out again and the temperature was in the low 60s. It was a genuinely beautiful morning. I made myself feel it this time instead of just noting it. I drove with music on and the windows cracked. I told myself that the hard part was over, that I'd done the right things, and that I'd been smart and careful. Now I was going home and my life was still mine. Everything looked exactly the same when I got there. The building looked the same, my floor looked the same, and my door looked the same. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The apartment smelled like the cookies I'd baked almost 2 weeks ago now, which was actually a nice smell to come home to. I dropped my keys on the counter the way I always did and set my bag down. I stood there for a second just taking in the familiar quiet of my own place. I noticed noticed the particular way the afternoon light came through the window over the sink and the stack of books on the end table I'd been meaning to get to. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I felt something that was close to relief. And then I saw the mug. It was sitting in the sink, clean and upright. It was one of the white ceramic ones from the back of the cabinet that I hadn't used in weeks. I stood there staring at it for a moment, trying to make sense of it. I tried to remember if I'd left it there before I'd left. I tried to make my brain find any explanation that wasn't the one it was already sprinting toward. I couldn't do it. And I couldn't get there because there was no version of the last 10 days where I had used that mug. I had been very careful before I left. I had washed every dish and put everything away because my anxiety had needed something to do and cleaning had been it. That mug had not been in the sink when I walked out of this apartment. I was still standing there staring at it when I heard shuffling behind me. I turned around and he was standing in the doorway to the hall. He looked thinner and his hair was longer, but his eyes were exactly the same as they'd always been. "Hey honey," he said with that bone-chilling smile. "Miss me?"